Keltaris looked out at the burning planets through the viewport of the command station. 3 generations of war had reduced entire civilizations to ash and memory. The Zorothian Empire, once thought to be undefeatable, had suffered losses that no one wanted to acknowledge. On the other side of the conflict, the human colonies of Earth were also bleeding, their resources depleted, their young people dying in trenches on alien worlds and in cold vacuum. The war had no real victor, only 2 sides that had forgotten why they were fighting. Territory disputes that seemed so important 200 years ago now felt meaningless when measured against the cost. Keltaris had fought in this war her entire life. She had been a young pilot once, full of fire and purpose, believing that victory was just one more battle away. Now, at 43 years old, she was a general, and she understood that victory might not come at all. The message came through secure channels from the Galactic Council. They proposed something that seemed impossible: a marriage. Not a political alliance or a trade agreement, but an actual marriage between her, one of the highest-ranking Zorothians, and a human captain of equal standing. The idea was to bind the 2 civilizations together with something deeper than politics or commerce. 2 people building a real relationship would show both species that peace was possible. Keltaris had responded with a simple message: she would do it. Not because she was romantic about it. She knew better than most that love stories were for children and dreamers. She agreed because the alternative was watching more planets burn, and she was tired of the burning. The human they selected for her was named Daniel Foster. He was a captain in the Earth Colonial Defense Force, decorated and respected, and apparently he had also agreed to this arrangement without hesitation. She researched him as much as possible before they met. He came from a military family, had fought in the same conflicts as her, and had never married. His record showed discipline, tactical intelligence, and something else that was harder to define. Compassion, maybe, or at least the appearance of it. They met on Meridian Crossing, a massive station floating between the 2 civilizations. The station had been built specifically for this kind of thing, as neutral ground where humans and Zorothians could work together. Keltaris arrived first, standing in the main chamber where the ceremony would take place. The Zorothian delegation was behind her, and somewhere in the station the human delegation was preparing. When Daniel walked in, Keltaris noticed several things very quickly. He was tall for a human, with dark hair and the kind of eyes that seemed to look at things carefully before forming opinions. He moved with the confidence of a soldier, but not the arrogance she had expected. He looked at her, and she saw what might have been nervousness cross his face before he composed himself. The ceremony was formal and strange, mixing Zorothian traditions with human ones. They exchanged vows written by lawyers and diplomats, words that were correct but empty. They signed documents. They stood together while both delegations watched and recorded everything for the news feeds across their respective worlds. By the time it was finished, they were legally married, even though they had never seen each other before this day. Daniel extended his hand after the ceremony. It was a human gesture, and Keltaris knew what it meant. She took his hand, and he smiled. It was not a big smile, just something small and genuine. He said, "I hope I'm not completely disappointing you." She almost laughed. In Zorothian society, such casualness would have been considered inappropriate. But she found herself responding with something close to honesty. "I was expecting to be disappointed. So I suppose this is an improvement." They were given quarters together on the station, 1 unit, designed for 2 people who might become partners or might remain strangers. The decorators had tried hard to make it blend Zorothian and human aesthetics, with limited success. Everything felt awkward and out of place, which seemed fitting for their situation. That first night, Daniel made dinner. It was a simple thing, nothing fancy. But he had taken the time to learn how to prepare food in a way that Zorothian digestive systems could tolerate. She found this gesture strange. He could have demanded that she eat human food or that they compromise with processed meals. Instead, he had studied her biology and her preferences, and he had made an effort. Over the following weeks, something unexpected began to happen. Daniel would ask her questions about her life, her culture, her family. He actually listened to the answers, rather than waiting for his turn to talk or to share his own perspective. He was curious in a way that felt genuine, not performative. When she talked about the war and the weight of command, he didn't try to fix her feelings or minimize her concerns. He simply sat with her in the sadness, For her part, Kale Terrace began to lower her defenses. She had spent so long in the military that she had almost forgotten how to be a person outside of duty and strategy. Daniel somehow reminded her. He told her about his childhood on Earth, about playing in oceans and forests, about a freedom that she had never experienced. She told him about the crystalline cities of Zoroth Prime, about the deep underground gardens where they grew food in the darkness, about traditions that stretched back thousands of years. 3 months into their arrangement, Kale Terrace realized she was happy. The realization startled her. She had not thought it was possible to be happy, especially not in circumstances like these. But walking with Daniel through the observation corridors of Meridian Crossing, watching him point out constellations and tell stories about ancient human explorers, she felt something in her chest that she recognized as contentment. One evening, she found him in their quarters looking out at the stars. She stood next to him, not touching, just being present. He reached over and took her hand without asking. This time, it felt different from the handshake after the ceremony. This felt like it meant something. "I think we might actually make this work," Daniel said quietly. Kale Terrace squeezed his hand. "I think so too." Neither of them knew what the future would bring. They had no idea that in just 3 years, the galaxy would face a threat more terrifying than anything they had known in the war. They had no idea that Daniel's quiet strength would transform into something dangerous and brilliant. They had no idea that this moment of connection, this small gesture of holding hands under the stars, would become the last time they truly understood each other. For now, though, they were simply two people who had been brought together by circumstance and had discovered that something real could grow between them, and that was enough. The 3 years of peace that followed the marriage of Daniel Foster and Kale Terrace felt like a different lifetime compared to the centuries of war. The Zorothian Empire and the human colonies, bound together by more than just politics now, began to build something unprecedented in the galaxy. Trade routes opened. Scientists began collaborative research projects. Young humans attended Zorothian military academies, and young Zorothians studied in human universities. The change was not instant or universal. There were still those on both sides who viewed the peace with suspicion. Old soldiers struggled with peace the way peace lovers struggle with war. Families who had lost loved ones in the conflict questioned whether one marriage could really erase centuries of bloodshed. But gradually the skepticism faded as people began to see that this peace was holding. Kale Terrace and Daniel became symbols of that peace. They made public appearances together, not as propaganda tools but as genuine representatives of what cooperation could look like. They were interviewed by news agencies across both civilizations. They opened colonies together, placing the cornerstone for the first truly joint settlement on a world that neither species had claimed before. It was called New Haven, and it represented everything the treaty had promised. Their personal life deepened as well. Daniel had moved through his military ranks slowly and deliberately, taking administrative positions that kept him closer to Meridian Crossing and to Kale Terrace. She had done the same, reducing her direct combat responsibilities in favor of diplomatic and strategic roles. They had developed routines. Every evening they would sit together and talk about their day. On certain nights they would cook together, blending human and Zorothian recipes in ways that should not have worked but somehow did. Kale Terrace had never imagined that she could love someone like this. She had assumed that love was something that happened to other people who had not spent their lives preparing for war. But love, she discovered, was not a luxury. It was a fundamental human and Zorothian experience, present in both their DNA and their hearts. Then the reports started coming in. They were fragmentary at first, rumors and unconfirmed intelligence. A small colony on the outer rim of the galaxy had gone silent. A mining station had stopped sending its regular communications. Ships traveling through certain routes had reported strange signals and then disappeared. These incidents could have been attributed to pirates, equipment failure, or simple communication errors. But they were too consistent, too organized, too ominous. The Galactic Council called for an emergency session. Representatives from dozens of species gathered to analyze the data and determine what was happening. The briefing room of Meridian Crossing filled way. The 3 years of peace that followed the marriage of Daniel Foster and Kale Terrace felt like a different lifetime compared to the centuries of war. The Zorothian Empire and the human colonies, bound together by more than just politics now, began to build something unprecedented in the galaxy. Trade routes opened. Scientists began collaborative research projects. Young humans attended Zorothian military academies, and young Zorothians studied in human universities. The change was not instant or universal. There were still those on both sides who viewed the peace with suspicion. Old soldiers struggled with peace the way peace lovers struggle with war. Families who had lost loved ones in the conflict questioned whether one marriage could really erase centuries of bloodshed. But gradually, the skepticism faded as people began to see that this peace was holding. Kael'Taris and Daniel became symbols of that peace. They made public appearances together, not as propaganda tools but as genuine representatives of what cooperation could look like. They were interviewed by news agencies across both civilizations. They opened colonies together, placing the cornerstone for the first truly joint settlement on a world that neither species had claimed before. It was called New Haven, and it represented everything the treaty had promised. Their personal life deepened as well. Daniel had moved through his military ranks slowly and deliberately, taking administrative positions that kept him closer to Meridian Crossing and to Kael'Taris. She had done the same, reducing her direct combat responsibilities in favor of diplomatic and strategic roles. They had developed routines. Every evening they would sit together and talk about their day. On certain nights they would cook together, blending human and Zorothian recipes in ways that should not have worked but somehow did. Kael'Taris had never imagined that she could love someone like this. She had assumed that love was something that happened to other people who had not spent their lives preparing for war. But love, she discovered, was not a luxury. It was a fundamental human and Zorothian experience, present in both their DNA and their hearts. Then the reports started coming in. They were fragmentary at first, rumors and unconfirmed intelligence. A small colony on the outer rim of the galaxy had gone silent. A mining station had stopped sending its regular communications. Ships traveling through certain routes had reported strange signals and then disappeared. These incidents could have been attributed to pirates, equipment failure, or simple communication errors. But they were too consistent, too organized, too ominous. The Galactic Council called for an emergency session. Representatives from dozens of species gathered to analyze the data and determine what was happening. The briefing room of Meridian Crossing filled with government officials, military commanders, and scientific experts. The holographic displays showed maps with red markers indicating where the disappearances had occurred. The pattern was clear to anyone who had studied warfare. Something was methodically clearing a path through settled space. It took 3 more incidents and the discovery of a derelict probe before they had a name: the Krell Dominion. Very few species had encountered the Krell and lived to tell about it. What the Council learned came from fragmentary records, old treaties, and information from the few civilizations that had survived contact with them. The Krell were a warrior species, seemingly bred for combat. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in chitinous armor that was both organic and technological in ways that science could not fully explain. They had conquered 17 civilizations without breaking a sweat. They had never shown mercy, never offered compromise, and never shown any sign of slowing down. And they were heading toward human and Zorothian space. The mood in the council chamber shifted immediately from optimism about peace to something darker: fear, the kind of fear that comes from understanding that everything you have built could be taken away by a force that you cannot negotiate with or reason with. One human admiral voiced what many were thinking. The alliance between humans and Zorothians was new. Perhaps it was not strong enough to face an enemy like this. Kael'Taris watched Daniel during this briefing. He sat quietly listening, and she could see his mind working through the information. She recognized that look from their early days together, when he would absorb details and process them into strategies. But there was something else in his expression now, something determined and intense. After the briefing ended, he immediately requested access to all available files about Krell warfare and tactics. He spent that entire night in the military archives, reading and analyzing every scrap of information they had. She found him the next morning, surrounded by data crystals and holographic displays. He had been there all night without sleeping. When she asked him what he was looking for, he simply said that they needed to understand the enemy. He said that understanding was the first step to victory, and that there would be no victory if they did not understand now. Kael'Taris saw her husband's obsession with a mix of pride and concern. She had known him to be dedicated, but this was something more. It was as if Daniel was already preparing for something, already working through problems that had not yet fully formed. She wanted to ask him what he was planning, but something in his intensity told her not to. Instead, she left him to his work and went to manage the political fallout from the briefing. The galaxy's two newest allies would soon face their greatest test. And Daniel Foster, the man she loved, was already preparing for something that she could not yet imagine. The first reports of actual Krell combat came 6 months after the initial contact warnings. A human mining colony on the frontier reported that their defensive systems had detected multiple Krell warships entering their airspace. The colony immediately sent a distress call and activated their shields. The message lasted for 17 seconds before cutting off. By the time human reinforcements could arrive, the colony was gone. Not destroyed in an explosion, but simply gone. The surface was scorched, every building flattened, every ship in orbit either destroyed or disabled. The Krell had not simply attacked. They had erased. The second incident came just days later. A Zerothian scientific outpost on an asteroid experienced the same fate. The Krell appeared, deployed their forces, and within hours nothing remained but death and destruction. This time there were survivors. 17 Zerothians managed to hide in an underground shelter and were rescued days later. Their testimony was consistent and terrifying. The Krell were not just strong. They fought with a precision and coordination that suggested a level of intelligence and culture that no one had expected. They were not mindless destroyers. They were soldiers of an extremely high order. The Galactic Council declared a state of emergency. All civilian ships were ordered away from frontier space. Military forces were mobilized and repositioned to defend the inner systems. The human and Zorothian fleets, which had never truly worked together in combat before, were now forced to coordinate their defensive efforts. It was during these frantic preparations that Daniel made his move. He walked into a joint command meeting where human and Zerothian admirals were gathered, arguing about defensive strategy. He presented a plan that no one had considered before. It was unconventional, perhaps even dangerous. It involved using small, fast strike teams with cutting-edge weapon systems to engage the Krell directly, rather than maintaining defensive positions. Most of the admirals dismissed it as suicidal. But when Daniel presented his tactical simulations, something strange happened. Every single simulation showed the same result. Human and Zorothian forces using his strategy defeated the Krell forces, even when outnumbered. The simulations were so consistent that they could not be dismissed as coincidence. The admirals wanted to know how he was modeling Krell behavior with such accuracy. Daniel explained that he had cross-referenced everything they knew about Krell tactics with historical warfare records from both human and Zorothian military archives, and then extrapolated their likely strategic patterns. It was brilliant work, and it was terrifying in its implications. He understood the Krell on a level that suggested he had been studying them far longer than the few months they had been known to exist. Kale Terrace watched her husband during this presentation, and she saw something that she had only glimpsed before. A side of him that was cold and calculating and utterly focused on victory. When he finished presenting his strategy, he requested command of a specialized strike force. The human admiral, Elizabeth Morgan, was skeptical but intrigued. She asked him why he should command a force this important when he had no direct combat experience against an alien enemy. Daniel responded simply, "Because I understand how to break them." The words hung in the air of the command center like a threat and a promise all at once. Kyle Taris felt something shift inside her, a small warning bell that she could not quite articulate. She had married a good man who wanted peace. But watching him speak with such certainty about breaking the galaxy's deadliest warriors, she wondered if she had ever truly known him at all. The admirals approved his request. He was promoted to Special Operations Commander and given authority to form and lead his strike force. Over the following weeks, he trained his team with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Kalteris tried to maintain their routines, tried to cook dinner and sit under the stars with him the way they used to. But Daniel was distant now, his mind always somewhere else, always thinking about the next battle, the next strategy. When she tried to talk to him about it, he simply held her and said that he had to do this. He said that if they did not stop the Krell, everything they had built would be destroyed. He promised her that once the threat was neutralized, he would come back to her, and they could return to the life they had built together. She believed him then, Because she loved him, and love makes people believe the things they need to believe. She did not know that the man she was holding was already transforming into something else. She did not know that the Daniel Foster who had learned to cook Zerothian food and who had held her hand under the stars was already beginning to fade away. By the time she understood what was happening, it would be too late to stop it. The Krell attacked Meridian Crossing on a Tuesday morning. The station had been designed with defensive capabilities, but no one had expected them to be tested in actual combat. The first Krell warship appeared on the sensors like a nightmare made manifest. It was vast, easily the size of a small moon, and it was moving toward the station with purposeful determination. Within minutes, 3 more ships appeared on the scanners, then 5. By the time the full attack was underway, the defensive team realized that they were facing a coordinated assault from an enemy fleet. Alarms sounded throughout Meridian Crossing. The civilian population scrambled toward the evacuation shuttles while the military personnel rushed toward their combat stations. Kael'Taris made her way to the command center, where she had no official authority but a lifetime of military training. She watched the screens as the Krell began to deploy their forces. Massive landing pods descended toward the station's outer docking bays. Combat shuttles cut through the void toward the defensive positions. Weapons fire lit up the darkness of space in strange and terrible patterns. Then Daniel's voice came through the communication system. He was broadcasting to the station, to the fleet, to everyone. His voice was calm and certain, with none of the doubt or hesitation that anyone might have expected. He told his strike force to hold position. He told the station's defenders to focus on maintaining the power grid and the communications array. He told Kael'Taris personally through a private channel that everything was going to be okay. And then he vanished from the command center. What happened next would be described in 1,000 different ways by the people who witnessed it. Some said they saw a blur of movement and combat that seemed more like ballet than warfare. Some said the Krell warriors, who had seemed invincible in every previous battle, suddenly began to fall like they were nothing. Some said Daniel Foster moved through the combat zones like death itself, unstoppable and cold and utterly certain in his purpose. What Kael'Taris saw was her husband transformed into something she did not recognize. He moved with a speed that should not have been possible for a human body. He fought with weapons and without weapons, his hands as deadly as any gun. The Krell warriors, these legendary creatures that had conquered 17 civilizations, seemed confused by his tactics. Their strength and armor meant nothing against someone who understood the gaps in their defensive patterns, who knew exactly where to strike to incapacitate rather than kill, who fought with a precision that suggested he had studied them not for months but for years. The first Krell warship in orbit began to malfunction. Then it exploded, breaking apart in a shower of debris. The second ship fired on the third, its own system somehow turning against it through a series of system cascades that no one could fully explain. Daniel's team moved through Meridian Crossing with military precision, and the Krell forces, for the first time in recorded history, found themselves in retreat. By the time the sun rose on the station again, the Krell had pulled back. The immediate threat had been neutralized. Casualty reports indicated that they had held the station with minimal losses. When Kael'Taris finally found Daniel, he was standing in the main concourse covered in blood that may or may not have been his own. His eyes were different, cold, empty of the warmth she had come to know. She asked him what he had done to the Krell warships, how he had made their systems malfunction. He looked at her, and for just a moment she saw confusion in his expression, as if he was remembering something from a dream. Then the cold certainty returned, and he simply said, "I understand how they work. I understand everything about them." That night, as she held him in their quarters, Kael'Taris realized that her husband was not the same man she had married. The war had not changed him so much as revealed him. The gentle scientist who cooked Zerothian meals and held her hand was still there, but he was buried so deeply beneath layers of strategy and capability that she was not sure she would ever find him again. She held him anyway, and she cried for the future that she was already beginning to lose. The celebrations that followed the Krell's retreat were unprecedented. Kael'Taris watched from the observation deck as fleet after fleet transmitted messages of congratulations to Daniel's strike force. Human colonies broadcast news of victory. Zerothian worlds declared it the greatest military accomplishment in their history. Daniel Foster was suddenly famous across the entire galaxy. News organizations that had never heard of him before were now competing to feature him on their primetime broadcasts. Governments wanted to honor him. Military academies wanted to study his tactics. Promotions followed quickly. He was given command of expanded forces. The Admiralty, both human and Zorothian, decided that the best way to ensure continued victory was to centralize more authority under his command. Within weeks, he was overseeing not just strike forces but significant portions of the combined fleet. Officers who had spent decades in the military found themselves reporting to a man who had risen to prominence in a matter of months. Keltaris tried to be supportive. She attended the ceremonies. She smiled for the cameras. She stood beside him at press conferences and told the reporters how proud she was of his accomplishments. But privately, she was watching him transform into something else entirely. Daniel began to spend more time away from their quarters. When he was there, he was distant, always thinking about something else, always working through some strategic problem in his mind. The easy intimacy they had developed over 3 years of peace began to deteriorate. She would wake up at night and find that he had left their bed to work on military simulations or to study new data about enemy capabilities. The other warning signs accumulated slowly. She noticed that he was placing his most trusted officers in positions of authority throughout both the human and Zorothian fleets. These officers were loyal to him personally, not to any government structure. She noticed that he was accumulating resources outside the normal chain of command. Equipment, ships, soldiers. Not in any way that was obviously illegal, but in patterns that, if you looked closely enough, suggested something larger was being planned. When she finally confronted him about it, they were in the observation lounge of Meridian Crossing, the same place where they had first held hands as a newly married couple. Daniel looked out at the stars and spoke quietly. He said that he had been preparing for something. He said that the Krell threat was not finished, that they would return, and that the galaxy was not prepared to face them. He said that the human and Zorothian governments were too slow, too divided by their own internal politics to mount an adequate defense. He said that he had seen what was coming, and the only way to survive it was through unity and strength concentrated under a single command structure. Keltaris asked him if he was talking about taking control of both governments. He did not answer directly. He simply said that he was talking about doing what was necessary. He said that history would judge him either as a savior or a tyrant, depending on whether his plans succeeded. He said that he was willing to accept that judgment, but he would not allow the galaxy to fall to the Krell. She felt something break inside her chest. This man, this person she loved, was describing something that sounded like the prelude to a military dictatorship. She tried to argue with him, tried to make him see that his solution might be worse than the problem. But he simply held her and said, "You do not understand the weight of what I have seen. You do not understand what it takes to save a civilization." That night, Keltaris made the most difficult decision of her life. She could not stop him through persuasion or argument. But she could not allow him to continue unchecked either. She contacted members of the Galactic Council and gave them information about Daniel's consolidation of power. She did not do it out of spite or betrayal. She did it because she loved him and because she knew that the path he was walking would destroy him. She did not know that her actions would trigger a political crisis that would threaten to tear apart the fragile peace that she and Daniel had worked so hard to build. She did not know that within weeks the galaxy would be divided into factions, some supporting Daniel's vision and others opposing it. She did not know that she would become the unwilling catalyst for a transformation of the political landscape far more significant than either the Krell threat or the original war. What she did know, as she lay awake in the darkness of their shared quarters that night, was that her marriage was over, not because love had died, but because she and the man she loved could no longer walk the same path. The political crisis exploded across the Galactic Council within 72 hours of the leaked information. Representatives from dozens of species demanded explanations about the authority consolidation. The media, which had been so eager to celebrate Daniel's military accomplishments, now turned its scrutiny toward his power structure. Investigative journalists began to examine the chain of command and discovered exactly what Keltaris had seen: a systematic placement of loyalists in key positions throughout both the human and Zorothian military structures. Daniel did not deny any of it. He went before the Galactic Council and presented his reasoning with the same cold precision that he had used to defeat the Krell. He said that the current governmental structures were too fractured to handle the threat that the galaxy faced. He said that the Krell would return, and next time they might not be stopped by tactics and individual brilliance. They would need unified command, centralized resources, and a military force that answered to a single strategic vision. The council was divided. Some members saw merit in his argument. Others viewed him as a threat to their autonomy. The human government was particularly divided. Some military leaders supported him, but political leaders worried about democratic principles being undermined. The Zerothian Empire had never been as invested in democracy, but even they recognized that giving one person too much power could lead to disaster. Keltaris testified before the council, describing Daniel's consolidation efforts and her concerns. But she was careful not to condemn him. She presented facts and observations, not accusations. The moment she finished speaking, Daniel himself took the stand. He did not attack her or make her look foolish. Instead, he spoke about how he understood her concerns, how he appreciated that she was the only person he knew who would have the courage to stand against him when she believed it was necessary. He said, "I love my wife. I love her more than I love any political power. But I love the galaxy more, and I would not allow love to blind me to what is necessary." The gallery erupted in reaction. Some people stood to applaud him. Others shouted in outrage. The atmosphere in the council chamber became charged with tension and division. In that moment, Keltaris saw what her decision to leak the information had accomplished. She had forced the galaxy to confront a fundamental question about whether one person, no matter how brilliant or capable, should be allowed to consolidate that much power. Over the following weeks, the council implemented oversight mechanisms to monitor Daniel's military authority. They limited his ability to make autonomous decisions. They required that major strategic changes be approved by committee. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but it prevented the immediate crisis from escalating into open conflict. Daniel accepted the restrictions without visible resentment. He continued to command his forces, but now under the watchful eyes of political overseers who questioned his decisions and demanded explanations. Keltaris watched from diplomatic sessions as her husband operated within these new constraints. He was patient and methodical, never pushing too hard against the limitations but always looking for ways to work within them to advance his larger vision. They maintained their marriage on paper. They lived in the same quarters and attended public events together. But in private, they barely spoke. The intimacy that had developed so carefully over 3 years of peace had evaporated like water in vacuum. Sometimes, late at night, Keltaris would find Daniel standing at the viewport looking out at the stars with an expression that was impossible to interpret. She wanted to ask him if he regretted what he had become, or if he was simply waiting for the right moment to consolidate his power again. She wanted to ask him if he still loved her, or if she had become just another complication to be managed in pursuit of his larger goals. But she never asked these questions because she was afraid of the answers. The galaxy had changed. The man she had married had changed, and the uneasy stalemate between them was all that remained of what had once been a genuine bond of affection and hope. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and loaded with potential for conflict. Neither of them knew how it would end. 3 months after the Galactic Council's restrictions on Daniel's authority, the Krell returned. They came not in the massive attack formation that had characterized their first assault, but in smaller waves, testing defenses and probing for weaknesses. It appeared to be a reconnaissance mission, a way for the Krell to gather intelligence about the changes in human and Zerothian defensive capabilities. Daniel analyzed the attack patterns with meticulous attention to detail. He presented his findings to the Council, demonstrating that the Krell were systematically mapping the combined fleet's new defensive positions. He provided projections about where the Krell would likely strike next and what kind of attack they should prepare for. His analysis was detailed and precise, and it bought them time to reinforce their positions and prepare for the next assault. But there was something else in his presentation, something subtle that only Keltaris seemed to notice. When he was describing the Krell's strategic approach, there was a tone in his voice that suggested something more than analytical detachment. There was almost a note of admiration. He seemed to respect his enemies in a way that went beyond professional acknowledgement. After the council meeting ended, she followed him to his office. She found him standing at his window, looking out at the shipyards where the combined fleet was being expanded and reinforced. She asked him directly, "Are you planning something?" He turned to look at her, and for the first time in months, she saw something that resembled the man she had married. But it was like looking at a photograph of someone you used to know. The details were recognizable, but the essence was missing. He said, "I am always planning something." "That is what I do." She pressed him. She asked if he was planning to use the Krell threat to remove the council restrictions and consolidate power again. She asked if he had analyzed the Krell not to defeat them, but to learn from them, to understand how to organize his own forces in similar patterns. Daniel sat down at his desk and looked at her for a long moment before responding. "Do you remember what I told you when we first met?" She shook her head. He continued, "I said I hoped I would not be completely disappointing. I think I have failed in that regard. I think I have been exactly what you feared I might be." The admission hung in the air between them. He did not confirm or deny her accusations. He simply accepted that she had come to know him well enough to understand what he was becoming. Kael'Teris felt tears forming in her eyes. She asked him why he was telling her this now, why he was not defending himself or explaining away her concerns. He said, "Because you deserve honesty. Because I love you. Even if I have become someone who loves you in a way that might be calculated and strategic rather than pure and simple. Because I want you to understand that when I do what I'm going to do, it will not be out of malice or darkness. It will be out of a genuine conviction that it is the only way to save what matters." She asked him what he was going to do, but he simply shook his head and said that he could not tell her. He said that it was better that she did not know the specifics, better that she could maintain plausible deniability if things went wrong. That night, Kael'Teris made a decision. She could not stop him. She could not prevent what was coming. But she could ensure that there were people watching, people who understood what was happening and could bear witness to it. She reached out to trusted members of both human and Zerothian governments. She told them that Daniel was planning something significant, something that would likely involve another attempt to consolidate power using the Krell threat as justification. She warned them to be prepared to have plans in place for how they would respond. Some of them were skeptical. Others were angry at her for continuing to warn them about a man who had saved the galaxy. But enough of them took her seriously that when Daniel's next move came, there would be people ready to monitor it and document it, and ultimately judge whether his actions were necessary or tyrannical. The stage was set for a final confrontation, though none of them could predict how it would play out or what the consequences would be. Kael'Teris lay awake in her bed, thinking about the choice she had made to leak information to the council. That choice had seemed difficult at the time, but it had been relatively simple. She had betrayed her husband's plans to prevent a political crisis. This new choice felt infinitely more complicated. She was positioning herself to oppose him, to stand against what was coming. She was accepting that their marriage was ending, that she could no longer maintain the fiction of being his supportive partner. She was embracing the role of his opponent, which was perhaps the cruelest thing she could do to someone she loved. But she did it anyway because she knew what was at stake, not just for herself or for Daniel, but for the entire galaxy. Whatever came next would reshape everything. Outside the viewport of Meridian Crossing, the stars shone with indifferent light. Somewhere in the darkness, the Krell moved through space. Somewhere else, ships were being readied for conflict. And in the quiet of her quarters, Kael'Teris waited for the future to arrive.